Growing up, my life was simple. It was just me and my dad. My mom passed away when I was too young to fully understand it all. I have only a few hazy memories of her. Her warm smile, the way she'd hum a tune while cooking, and the gentle comfort of her hugs. After she passed, it was just the two of us. My dad did his best to fill both roles, and honestly, he did a pretty good job. He worked hard, the kind of guy who'd spend long hours at his job but still make time for me. He never missed a school play, a soccer game, or any of our little traditions. Fridays were for takeout and movies, and Sundays meant pancakes and trips to the park. Looking back, those were the good times, even if we didn't have much. Things started to shift when I was around 12. That's when Dad met Karen. I remember the first time he introduced her to me. He was nervous, like a teenager on a first date. Karen seemed nice enough initially. She smiled a lot, asked me about school, and even brought cookies. I could tell she was trying, and even though I missed my mom, I wanted my dad to be happy. For a while, things were fine. When Dad married Karen, I didn't have much say in it, and I tried to make the best of things. But it didn't take long to realize that Karen's son, Jake, was the favored one. No matter what Jake did, Karen always looked the other way, while I was held to a different standard. Jake was the type who coasted through life without a care. He never held a job for long, constantly dodged responsibilities, and whenever he flaked out on something, Karen would always have an excuse ready. "He's just figuring things out," she'd say, or "he'll find his way eventually." Meanwhile, I was expected to keep up good grades, help around the house, and be the dependable one. It wasn't just about chores or schoolwork, though. It was the way Karen treated us differently. If I slipped up even a little, there were consequences. Groundings, lost privileges, the whole 9 yards. But when Jake messed up, it was shrugged off. He'd miss curfew, skip school, or blow off family events, and Karen would just wave it away with a "boys will be boys" excuse. It was infuriating. What really got to me was how oblivious my dad seemed. He was trying to be a father figure to Jake, which I understood, but sometimes it felt like he was so focused on keeping the peace that he didn't notice Karen's blatant favoritism. There was this one summer when I'd saved up for months, mowing lawns and doing odd jobs to buy a new bike. Just when I was about to buy it, Jake decided he wanted a new gaming console. Karen convinced Dad to chip in using some of the savings, leaving me with just enough to settle for a cheaper bike. It wasn't about the bike itself, it was the principle of it. The favoritism showed up in every corner of our lives. At family gatherings or during holidays, Jake was always the one at the center, cracking jokes and drawing all the attention. Karen would beam at him like he was the best thing in the world, while I sat quietly on the sidelines, knowing I'd never be seen the same way. I tried talking to Jake once, suggesting he find something he cared about and stick to it, but he just shrugged it off with his usual, "I'll figure it out someday." That was his go-to, always someday, never now. It was frustrating, but there was nothing I could do. Karen wasn't going to change, and as long as she kept enabling Jake, he wasn't going to grow up. My dad noticed, but he wanted to keep the peace, so he stayed quiet, hoping that things would somehow balance out. By the time I was a teenager, I was counting down the days until I could move out. I didn't hate my dad, but our house didn't feel like home anymore. It was just a place I endured. Finally, I got out. I found a tiny apartment, started working, and focused on building a life for myself. It wasn't easy, but it was mine. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe. But just when I thought I'd left the past behind, things took a turn I wasn't expecting. After a few peaceful years on my own, life threw me a curveball I never saw coming. Dad passed away. It wasn't sudden. He'd been sick for a while, but it didn't make it any easier to handle. Losing him felt like the last tie to my old life was severed. The days when it was just the two of us felt like they belonged to a different world now. At his funeral, I saw Karen and Jake both putting on somber faces. I kept my distance, though. After all the tension and favoritism over the years, I didn't have it in me to play the grieving, happy family dot after the funeral. I wasn't expecting much from Dad's estate. We weren't wealthy, but he'd always been smart with his savings. To my surprise, Dad had left me a modest inheritance. It wasn't a windfall, but it was enough to help me get a fresh start and build something for myself. With that money, I was finally able to start looking for a place in the city, something bigger, better, and all my own. I spent weeks searching for the right spot. The city's expensive, and I wanted it to be perfect, something that would make Dad proud. Finally, I found it. A sleek, modern apartment with a view of the city lights. A little pricey, but worth every penny. I used part of the inheritance as a down payment, added in my own savings, and took out a loan. I remember the first night after moving in, standing by the window and looking out over the city, feeling like I was finally in control of my life. But as it turned out, my fresh start wasn't as clean as I thought. I'd barely gotten settled when Karen called me out of the blue, sounding oddly polite. "We need to meet," she said, skipping over any pleasantries. She wouldn't tell me over the phone what it was about, only that it was important family business. Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a cafe near my apartment. I figured she wanted to talk about Dad, or maybe settle some last matters regarding his estate. I got to the cafe a bit early, grabbed a table by the window and waited. When Karen walked in, my stomach dropped. She wasn't alone. Jake followed right behind her, looking as disinterested as ever, his hands stuffed in his hoodie pockets, avoiding eye contact. This wasn't a family discussion about Dad. I could feel the setup a mile away. Karen sat down, flashing a tight smile, pretending like she was here for some friendly chat. "Thanks for meeting with us," she began, like we were at some formal meeting. "I thought it would be good for Jake to talk to you directly." I just stared, not saying anything, waiting for her to cut to the chase. Jake was quiet, fidgeting with his sleeve, not even making an effort to look at me. Karen leaned in, her tone softening as if she were about to share some tragic story. "Jake's in a bit of a tough spot right now," she began. "He really needs a place to stay, your family. I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this." I felt my jaw clench as I looked at her. "Karen, we've been over this. I can't take Jake in. I've got my own life, my own place to manage, and I can't have him crashing here. Before she could respond, Jake finally spoke up, mumbling, "It's just for a little while. I'll get back on my feet, I promise." He wasn't even looking at me as he said it, eyes fixed on the table. I'd heard that line a dozen times before from him, and it never meant anything. "Jake," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. "This isn't about just letting you crash here. You need to figure things out, for real. You can't keep expecting people to bail you out. But Karen wasn't about to let that slide. She cut in, her voice sharper. "You know, your father would have wanted you to help. He always believed in family. I can't believe you're turning your back on us like this. That hit a nerve." She knew exactly what she was doing, bringing Dad into this. It was a low blow, and I wasn't going to let it slide. "My dad also believed in standing on your own 2 feet, I shot back. "I've worked hard for everything I have, and I'm not throwing that away because you think I owe Jake something." Things got heated from there. Karen started on a guilt trip about how Jake had no one else, how family should stick together, and how I was being selfish by not letting him stay. Jake, for his part, looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, barely even listening, which only made me angrier. He wanted my help, but couldn't even be bothered to take the conversation seriously. Then Karen dropped the bombshell she'd been saving. "If you don't help, I'll have to take legal action." Her voice was ice cold as she looked at me. "You used part of the inheritance for that apartment, and technically Jake has a claim." I felt my blood pressure spike. "Are you serious?" I snapped. "You're going to drag this into court just to force me to take Jake in?" Karen didn't even flinch. "I'm just doing what's best for my son," she replied, as if she were discussing the weather. She was willing to ruin whatever was left of our relationship over this. I couldn't believe it. I stood up, grabbing my jacket. "If that's how you want to play it, fine. Do what you have to do, but don't expect me to just roll over." With that, I walked out, leaving them sitting there in stunned silence. I couldn't believe how far Karen was willing to go to push this on me. It felt like they'd planned the entire ambush, and the worst part was knowing this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't going to give up that easily, and Jake was just going to ride it out as long as he could. On my way home, I kept replaying the whole conversation in my head, thinking of all the ways I could have handled it differently. But deep down, I knew there was no winning with Karen. She'd always find a way to twist things to her advantage. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was exhausted, mentally and emotionally drained. I dropped onto the couch, staring out the window at the city lights, trying to figure out what my next move would be. One thing was clear though, this fight was far from over. After that showdown at the cafe, I thought maybe, just maybe, Karen would back off. But of course, I was wrong. A few days later, I got an email from my dad's old attorney, Mr. Davis. It was one of those, "We need to discuss an important matter regarding your father's estate," kind of messages, the kind that never brings good news. I figured Karen had stirred something up, but I had no idea what I was walking into. When I got to Mr. Davis's office, he didn't waste any time. "Michael," he began, looking serious, "your stepmother has raised some concerns about how the inheritance was used for your apartment. She's suggesting that your stepbrother Jake has a legal right to the property." I almost laughed. "You're telling me Karen's actually trying to pull this?" I asked, barely holding back my frustration. Davis nodded. "She's claiming that since part of your inheritance was used for the down payment, Jake has a stake in it. If this goes to court, there's a chance a judge might agree with her." I couldn't believe it. "Come on, Davis," I said, trying to stay calm. "The inheritance was split fair and square. I used my share, plus my own savings and a loan. Jake got his share too. What he did with it is his business. You quote rewrite," Mr. Davis agreed. "But the law can get tricky when it comes to family disputes, especially with inheritance. Her argument is weak, but if she pushes hard enough, it could become a real headache for you." Fantastic. Just what I needed. A legal nightmare, courtesy of Karen. I left Mr. Davis's office feeling like I'd been sucker punched. The lengths Karen was willing to go to were unbelievable. She was willing to drag me through court just because I wouldn't let Jake crash at my place. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I couldn't sit back and wait for her to strike. If she wanted a fight, I had to be ready. The next morning, I reached out to a lawyer a friend had recommended, a tough, no-nonsense attorney named Sarah who specialized in estate disputes. When we met, Sarah didn't waste time sugarcoating things. "Do you have documentation showing how the apartment was paid for?" she asked. "Yeah, I've got receipts, bank statements, everything," I replied. The inheritance only covered about 10% of the cost. The rest was my savings and a loan. Sarah looked pleased. "Good, that's going to help us, but we need to dig a little deeper to make sure there are no surprises. With Karen, there were always surprises, and sure enough, it didn't take long for one to pop up. About a week later, Sarah called me into her office. She looked serious, almost tense. "Michael, I found something interesting while reviewing your father's estate records," she said. "It seems there are assets that were never disclosed during the initial settlement. Investments, property accounts, assets your father owned but were somehow overlooked. Lisa claimed them as her own." I stared at her, stunned. "Wait, you're telling me Karen hid assets from me?" "That's what it looks like," Sarah confirmed. "These assets should have been included in the inheritance split, but Karen kept them to herself. It was a shocking revelation. Karen had always been manipulative, but this was a new level of deceit. She'd hidden a chunk of my dad's estate, kept it for herself, and now had the audacity to come after my apartment. I felt a rush of anger that went deeper than anything I'd felt before. "What do we do now?" I asked, my mind racing. Sarah was ready. "We have two options. We can file a claim to contest the original estate settlement, which will probably lead to a lengthy court battle, or we can use this information as leverage to get her to back off." I didn't need to think twice. "Let's go after her," I said firmly. "If she wants to play dirty, fine, but she's not getting away with this. Over the next few weeks, things started heating up. Sarah and her team gathered every bit of evidence they could, and it turned out Karen had been sitting on a small fortune. Investments, a rental property, even hefty bank accounts, all of it hidden from me during the original estate split. Meanwhile, Karen was still trying to push her claim on my apartment, even rallying some distant family members to pressure me, sending guilt-tripping messages about how family should stick together and how Jake needs your help. I wasn't buying it. Finally, the day came when Sarah filed the claim. It was official. We were going after Karen for hiding assets. The look on her face when she found out was priceless. She hadn't seen it coming, and for once, she didn't have a quick comeback. But I knew this was far from over. Karen wasn't the type to go down without a fight. As we geared up for the legal battle, I couldn't help but think about how things had spiraled to this point. Karen had always been about control, making sure Jake had an easy ride through life, no matter what it cost anyone else. But I wasn't the kid who had to sit quietly while she played favorites. I had a life of my own now, my own space, and I wasn't going to let her tear that down. This time, it was my fight, and I was ready to see it through. The court dates that followed were grueling. Every time I walked into that courtroom, I felt like I was stepping onto a battlefield. Karen was there, sitting smugly as if she thought she was untouchable, throwing me pitying glances like I was the problem here. But Sarah was relentless. She tore through every one of Karen's excuses with the precision of a scalpel, laying out the hidden assets like evidence at a crime scene. Karen's entire defense was built on lies, and it was obvious to everyone in the room. When Sarah presented the hidden investments and unreported bank accounts, I saw the judge's expression shift. It was clear they weren't buying Karen's sob story about accidentally overlooking those accounts. In the end, the ruling came down in my favor. Karen had to pay back what she owed from the hidden assets, and her ridiculous claim about Jake having a right to my apartment was thrown out. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like a weight had been lifted. For the first time, I felt free. But the fallout didn't end there. Word spread fast in the family, and suddenly everyone seemed to have an opinion. I got calls and messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, telling me how I was tearing the family apart, or asking, "Why couldn't you just let it go?" It was frustrating to hear, especially since they hadn't been around when I needed support growing up. Now, all of a sudden, they wanted to talk about family values and make me the villain for standing up for myself. It felt isolating, but I couldn't let it get to me. I had my own life to live, my own peace to protect. And for the first time in a long time, I could actually focus on that without Karen and Jake looming over me. I had a clear path ahead, and I was ready to walk it. Just when things started settling down, Jake showed up. I hadn't seen him since the cafe ambush, so seeing him on my doorstep was a shock. He looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. For a second, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice low and hesitant. I didn't really want to get dragged back into their mess, but I let him in. We sat down, and he started to ramble, telling me how Karen had kicked him out after losing the case, saying she was selling the house and didn't want him around anymore. He was desperate, and I could tell he was about to ask if he could stay with me. I cut him off before he could get too deep into his story. "Jake, we've been through this," I said firmly. "I can't help you. You need to figure this out on your own dot." He looked defeated, but he didn't argue. He just nodded, muttered a quiet, "Thanks for hearing me out," and left. It was the most mature conversation we'd ever had, which honestly was kind of sad. With Jake gone, things finally started to quiet down. I didn't hear from Karen again, and the family slowly backed off, realizing they weren't going to change my mind. I had my peace, and I was finally able to move forward. But there was still a lingering feeling, a scar left from the whole ordeal. Karen had manipulated everyone, turning people against me, and it was a hard lesson in how quickly people could turn on you. Months went by, and life returned to normal. I focused on work, made new friends, and enjoyed the calm that came with not constantly looking over my shoulder for the next wave of family drama. Then, one evening as I was lounging on the couch, my phone buzzed. I almost ignored it, figuring it was another spam call. But when I checked, I saw her name, Karen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity, or maybe a sense of closure, made me pick up "Hello?" I answered, keeping my voice neutral. There was a long pause on the other end before her voice came through, softer than I'd ever heard it. "Michael, it's me." "I know," I replied coldly. "What do you want, Karen?" Another pause. She sounded defeated. I need your help," she said, her voice shaky. "My life has fallen apart since the court case. I lost the house. The money's almost gone. I've got nothing left." I stayed silent, letting her words sink in. Part of me wanted to feel smug, to tell her she deserved it after everything she'd put me through, but I didn't. Hearing her like that, so broken, didn't bring me any satisfaction. "I don't have anyone else to turn to," she continued. "Ethan's struggling too. I just need a little help, just enough to get back on my feet." I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "Why me, Karen? After everything you've done, why would you think I'd help you?" She took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. Because you're the only one who can. I know I don't deserve it. I know I've been awful, but I'm desperate. There it was, an admission I never thought I'd hear from her. Karen admitting she'd been wrong, even just a little, didn't erase the years of manipulation. But it was something. I quote, "I'll think about it," I said, my tone still distant. "But don't get your hopes up." She thanked me, her voice trembling, and we ended the call. I sat there staring at the phone, trying to process what just happened. Karen, the woman who'd spent years making my life a living hell, was now begging for my help. It felt surreal. Over the next couple of days, her words echoed in my head. I didn't owe her anything. She'd made her bed and now she was lying in it. But despite everything, I couldn't shake the image of her desperate and defeated. I couldn't completely turn my back on her. In the end, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let her move in or bail her out entirely, but I could give her a small amount to cover her basic needs for a couple of weeks. It wasn't for her. It was for me, a way to close this chapter on my own terms. When I called her back, I laid it out clearly. "Karen, listen carefully. I'll send you a small amount, just enough to cover the basics. But that's it. Don't ask for more. She sounded relieved, almost tearful. "Thank you, Michael. I can't tell you how much this means. Don, quote, T, make it more than it is," I warned. "This is temporary. You need to figure things out on your own. She promised she would, and I transferred the money. It wasn't a lot, just enough to cover food and rent for a short while. After that, I felt a strange mix of relief and caution. Part of me felt lighter, knowing I'd done something decent, even for someone who didn't really deserve it. But another part of me braced for what might come next. Karen wasn't the type to let things go. The weeks passed, and things stayed quiet. I didn't hear from Karen or Jake, which was a relief. Maybe she'd finally taken my warning seriously. I had my life back and could focus on moving forward. Deep down, I realized that helping Karen wasn't about her. It was about proving to myself that I could rise above her games, that I could do the right thing, even when it was hard. This didn't erase the past or make everything okay, but it was a step forward, and for now, that was enough.